So I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to come and present to everybody today. I'm going to talk about my journey from being a design student to being a startup founder or co-founder. And it's great to hear that Oscar is coming in next month, because Oscar is definitely my mentor and has played a role in this journey. Okay, so now. So there I am. This was probably about 1998. And that was my first co-op job, where I lived in Atlanta and worked for Philips Magnavox. The guy standing next to me, his name was Todd, and he was my boss. And so a couple of things about my behavior from this first job that I had in design that kind of led me on the pathway. One, I was a budding typographer even from the start. The types of things that they had me working on my first co-op was making coupons for Sears. So really small real estate, but it was a good typographic challenge for me to still make things legible. On this co-op, I was always asking questions and not afraid to do what I wanted. And sometimes that was not for the better. So I got yelled at one time for a project, and my biggest takeaway from working from that large company is that it was an awesome experience, but I kind of needed to be in a place where I was serving others and kind of making my own rules. So as I move forward in design school, a lot of the things that I was creating, this was a poster made probably around the 4th year of design school, that just was experimental. I like to ask myself a lot of what if questions. Upon graduating, I worked for a small studio here in Cincinnati, inner city Cincinnati, and we did a lot of design works for like Nickelodeon and Nick Jr. and Disney and things like that. But one of the things that I got the privilege of working on was this book here for Herbert Ritz. He was a famous photographer, and it was in memory of him. And in that job also, I created this book series as well as stationery series that was called Sassy Sisters. The goal of this was to motivate girls of color to know that they could do whatever they wanted. And I think a lot when I think about this book, I knew from the get-go that I wanted to help motivate people to see that there's a lot of opportunities beyond what they're seeing at that point. So after I created this book working for that company, I got bored and I decided to go back to North Carolina State and get my master's degree, because I also knew that I needed to be in a part of industry that allowed me to do more service to people and use design to have service to people. Well, it was during this time that I developed my thesis that led to the startup. So now I'm going to talk to you about the process of developing that thesis. But before I do, I've got to tell you about the inspiration for it so you can understand the context. So I'm going to share with you a little story, all right? So imagine it's 10:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and you're sitting at your desk in the 3rd grade preparing to take the big test on American inventors. After studying many hours with your father and actively participating in class discussion and watching several PBS specials, you're ready to take the test. There you sit as your teacher places a sheet of paper in front of you. The page is full of words that have to be decoded in order to prove that you have mastered the text being given to you. But try as you may to decipher the questions being asked, for the most part, the text is just incomprehensible. And at that moment, you reside to the fact that you've just failed another test, but you can't figure out why it is you can't read. Now, to most of us, this is a foreign experience. However, to Caleb, it was a way of life. You see, Caleb was the witty 9-year-old son of one of my dearest friends, and he's the inspiration for this project. He, along with 20% of our population, struggle with dyslexia. And so he came home one day and he started complaining that the reason why he believed he kept failing his test is because of the way that they laid out the page. Well, me being a graphic designer, I was like, well, if I could create a page template to help address his issues, I would. So I began researching it in graduate school. And while it wasn't the page layout, I did realize that there were some strategies that we use as graphic designers that could possibly help teach early reading skills. But before I could get there, I needed to do some research and get past the assumptions that I might have on what even dyslexia is. So I looked up the definition and I spent a lot of time trying to unpack the issues surrounding dyslexia, because just from an outsider, you know, you've always heard it said that they read backwards, which is not actual. That's not the actual truth. Anybody that's first learning to read will reverse letters. So it's a sign of early reading skills and not necessarily of dyslexia. So during the research that I created, I stumbled along this study that came about in 1975. Prior to 1975, people thought that people who had dyslexia, maybe they just had an eye problem, that they couldn't see well, and we haven't designed the right glasses to help them see well. Well, this study in 1975 dispelled that myth that it had something to do with vision. And it actually began to outline what are the core reading-related issues surrounding dyslexia. And when I discovered this list here, I realized that there's about 3 things on this list where I think I could use visual and multisensory strategies to help bridge the gap between what they need to know and what they were actually learning. So before I actually started making anything, I did do a visual audit of who's out there making things at the time around literacy and reading. And I ran into researching this person named Natasha French, who had developed this typeface called Read Regular. At the time, she said that she felt it was like the solution for dyslexia. And her goal was to try and visually distinguish the letter forms from each other. So if you take a moment here and look at the B and the D, you can see that the counter spaces in the B differ from the D. So just visual tropes that still build consistency among the letter forms, but also distinguish them. While I think that this is a beautifully done typeface, I think it's excellent for early readers, but I don't think it addresses the issues around dyslexia because, as I said, the research study in 1975 dispelled the myth that it was a visual perception problem. It's more of a cognitive to visual issue. And I will say this for anybody who has dyslexia out there, that is a big umbrella term and a lot of little terms inside of it, and a lot of little issues inside of it. But right now, I'm going to share with you a typeface that I developed, originally called Phonetical, and this was my first attempt at trying to visualize or give visual cues in how to pronounce something. So take notice of the O's in this slide. In the word hour, when you say hour, your jaw drops long as you're saying the O, ah. In the word two, it spreads wide, ooh. And in the word chosen, your mouth sounds stays rounded. So I was coming up with this visual strategy to try and help cue the reader as to mouth position as they were speaking. The only issue with this, I think, after we did some testing, is that it is a bitmap typeface. So an early reader, when they looked at it, it left them saying, huh, like that. So first round didn't work out. It's all good. You go back and you keep researching this. And so I realized that I needed to talk more to a much more multidisciplinary team to try and get more facts around issues of dyslexia and reading. And so I cold called people. I went to a private school down in North Carolina State that specialized in teaching dyslexic and ADHD learners, and they allowed me to observe in the classroom and bring to them the things that I was making for feedback. And all of these people helped shepherd me along the way. Well, after graduate school was over, I was offered a position at the University of Cincinnati, and while there, started developing a new team of collaborators to actually take which were just visual experiments, really, and began making them into something that was testable. So my main focus of research inside of some public schools. So again, going back to this study that outlined the core reading related tasks, I was trying to take on 2, 3, and 4 of different ways of how do I help bridge the gaps with them. So the first one that I took on, which ultimately drove the first product made, was number 2, mapping sounds to symbol. So the way that this worked is that if you were reading on screen and there were letters and you couldn't remember what sound the letter makes, you simply trace over the letter form and it will unlock hidden clues. Saying the clues aloud cues you to hearing the sound for the letter. So magnet, magnifying glass, milk. The common sound is mm. The same way with the P, you trace it, and when traced properly, you get peach, peapod, pie. The common sound is P. So the heart of the tool that we began developing at the University of Cincinnati was based on this hard-coded font. It's not really a typable font, but it was an idea for a font that used Myriad Pro as its base. So with that, we worked together collaboratively with professors from the College of Education and Educational Psychology, and we developed this application that allowed for personalized learning, so the teacher could set customized curriculum. It also created a multi-sensory learning experience through audio and kinesthetic trace. And this app was evidence-based. We spent 4 or 5 years testing efficacy studies to see in what ways would this influence reading. So the other half of this application is that there was a teacher's application that allowed them to customize lessons on what they wanted their students to work on, as well as track the different outcomes of the student. And so inside of this, again, the core was trying to cue students to remember what sound belonged to what letter form. So when you get to the base of this, we were really trying to visualize the 44 sounds of the English language, which is the biggest symbol set that I've ever took on trying to create. And I know you can't see all of the images here, but my graduate student and I, we took a year and a half to try and visualize all 44 sounds to the English language. And so with that came this application. The last level of the application had the student reading on screen, and anytime they would run into a sound they couldn't remember, they would get the cues of how to pronounce it. This last level, as we tested it inside of schools, kind of gave me the idea of where we needed to go next in product development. A lot of the teachers gave feedback of, hey, I want to change the words in the story, or I want to write my own story. We had hard-coded this because this app is applicable to iPads. And so we chose which sounds the students could actually click on. But they said, hey, what if I want other sounds for them to click on in this level? So I knew that this ultimately needed to be a font. But when working on this originally in graduate school, the font technology was not necessarily there. But moving forward, variable font technology came about. And so my team and I partnered to develop a new typeface, which we call C-type. Just want to take a pause here and introduce the team behind the products that's moving forward. So at this point where we're starting to work on C-type is also where I began launching a startup company. I have a co-founder whose name is Nancy Kors, and then you can see Oscar there. Oscar's playing a big role in the font development and the icons used in the font. Partnering with Frida Moreno, who is technically programming the font, along with Akshat and our educational contributors, and we have a CTO. So the font C-type, it is uses a Roboto base, and what we're doing is still embedding image cues inside the letter forms, and the letter forms will morph between the images, just as you saw with the pictures. There's a lot that went into this as we were thinking about what weight it needed to be, how to pair the icons to the letter forms memorably, how wide or how tall the letter forms could be so that they don't impact or disturb other letters that are sitting beside them. Did a lot of testing at this stage of the recognizability of these icons. I have 2 nieces who are 5 and 3. At the time when we started this, they've grown some since then. And then my sister is the 2nd grade teacher, and my mom is a reading specialist. So all of them were able to weigh in and give feedback on this. Ultimately, what we programmed here is a typeface so that now if it's typed on screen and you're reading along and couldn't remember what sound the letter form make, it will morph into the different images, mouse and monkey. Or if you go over to the letter P, you get peach, penguin, pig. Saying the images aloud cues you to hearing it. But we didn't stop at just developing this typeface. We saw that this typeface might give broader help to a broader reach of people. The original applications that we created were for preschool to at-risk first graders, the first iPads app were. But we took these fonts and we embedded them inside of a browser extension so that the age range is much broader. So if you're an adult and you never quite got how to read, or English is your second language, or you're a third grader who just hasn't completely figured it out yet, installing this font inside of a web browser extension, now you can read any digital content that you love. Because one thing we know is that when you struggle to read, you kind of don't want to read because it points out your weakness, but you will read when it's something that you really love. So if you want to read ESPN or CNN, or in this case, Times for Kids, you just simply go to the website that's of interest to you and find an article that you're interested in. Once you find that article, you simply will click on our web browser extension, which will re-render the text on that screen in our font. And now as you're reading, any sound you don't know how to pronounce?
Peach, penguin, pig. Acorn, apron, alien.
So this is a pretty smart font. It's the first phonetic font to ever develop. It visualizes it understands when you type whether the vowel in the word is long vowel or short vowel, or a short vowel, and it will load the right images for it. Some letters, when they sit next to each other, they're blend together, like the T and H says and not just separated. Any letter that are blends, it will give you cues to help promote the blends. So again, we went through this activity now of making this typeface and visualizing the 44 sounds to the English language. And so Oscar is playing a really big role in this. So Oscar, I included your C-type specimen sheet here just to show the vast range of the work. It's taken us almost a year to develop this, and we're in final stages of production. So with this web browser extension, now any text is accessible from digital content that you read on the screen. But we also have another font that's still in conceptual mode that could easily be embedded inside of this web browser extension. We call it Squishy Squash, and it visualizes the orthographic patterns to the English language, or the rules to the English language. So if you are reading on screen and you didn't know what the A was, you click on it, it animates long because that's a long A, versus the other A is static because it's short. Or if you were looking at a word and there's a silent letter in the word, it will actually ghost back because it's something that's barely spoken. So what I'm trying to do is use visual strategies as well as motion cues to help cue you to figuring out the rules to the English language. So all of this is just not, hey, Reneé thought it up and decided to make it. It's actually based off of educational psychology. There are a lot of studies out there that have been done by educational psychologists and literacy experts that show that there is a strength to learning when you meaningfully pair images to letter forms, but never been done inside of a typeface before. So at this point, now that we have these three products, this is what the startup holds. It has Seward School, which is the iPad application, and then we splintered that off and made a home version so that parents could feel as though they're supporting their kids. And then Seward's Anywhere, that holds the C-type font, is our new product, and it's just in beta version. So it's free. You can go on and register and try it out. This journey with the startup and with the research and starting with the thesis has been great. We've received a lot of great accolades along the way. One that I'm proud to have received this year is being featured inside of Forbes magazine for our startup company. We've had a lot of great partners along the way that have allowed us to come into their schools and organizations and test out our different technologies. there, and I hope to do more because the web browser extension has not been tested yet, but we're excited for that testing to happen. We have spent many years with the iPad app testing inside of schools, after school programs of pre-K to first graders. The kids have thoroughly enjoyed it. They've helped me at times to see where improvements can be. One anecdotal story is that there was a kid that joined the club one year and his reading grew to be on target. So the following year he wanted to rejoin the club and they said, well, no, you don't have the same reading issues. You don't need it anymore. And he was upset by that. So the following day in his readings class, he purposefully tried to do worse so that he could rejoin the club and get to use C words again. So outcomes from the iPads app that lead us to believe that we will probably get some positive results in terms of the browser extension happen. We saw there was a significance in the growth of the students who were in our treatment group in terms of word identification. And if you look over to the right side, it talks about the spelling measure. Before the students were in C words treatment group, there was a gap between the treatment and the high and the low students. And after the 15 weeks of C words, we all but closed that gap in terms of spelling. So it has been making an impact from a data perspective as well. There's much more to come in the future as we think about this. In graduate school, I had all types of ideas of how do you embed visual cues inside of a printed page, which could easily pair with the digital, because I think the digital and the physical go hand in hand to helping someone learn. So these were pages where I was obsessed with the laser cutter and embedding visual cues to help them understand long. So they put their hands in the groove and it slides long versus the staccato points that mean short. Also had the idea of embedding moving image, which I think will be coming at some point inside the letter form. So you understand that the B is bouncy this way versus the P being squishy this way. Just using other means of helping someone distinguish between these letter forms. Also looking at tactile letter forms. If I could touch it, how do I know the difference between the sound versus something that's the sound? And if they were like clay digitally on the screen and I could manipulate them, would that help me remember? So then as I thought about VR and the role that it could play in observing in classrooms, I do think that there's a role for kids to be able to jump on and push and interact with the letter forms instead of in some of the inner city classrooms that I observed, they're imagining them doing it. What if they could really do it and understand the pressure that it comes from touching these things? As well as when I think about the role of AR with the fonts that we're creating, I think we could really put the read back into reading glasses with these fonts and AR technology. Now, as you're interacting in the physical world, any sign that you can't read, you give a fixation to, and we can have these fonts begin to animate over top of it to cue you and how to decode the words being talked about there. So I appreciate so much the time that you guys have given me, and I hope that this has been inspiring and beneficial to you. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Reneé.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Reneé, for the amazing thinking and great impact here. It's great.
You're welcome.
We had a question submitted via email by Devar. So let's see.
Hi, Devar.
Devar says, how can typography design help young students understand the importance of reading at a very young age?
Well, I think that there's a lot of apps out there, right, that are gaming apps. And so early on, teachers were sold a bill of goods that, hey, we designed these games and you'll learn to read, and they never quite worked, and the teachers are skeptical of it. So I think that gamification is great, but sometimes it can be too distracting. But I think what we've learned from this, that this has the right balance between interactive engagement, yet still having them learn the principles and not be distracted of, oh, I'm able to fly over a puddle or gain this reward. It has the right balance of learning to play inside of it. What's been interesting for me is that I teach typography at the University of Cincinnati. And so during the day, I would teach my typography 1 class where I was training them to draw different fonts. And then in the afternoon, I would go to the inner city school and they would be practicing their letters. And so it was like the same level of frustration over 2 different things, but in some ways they're very similar.
That's cool.
Any other questions?
I do. Moving forward, do you think about extending the program for other languages, like Spanish, or? Because I think a lot of the icons will work. We just have to move them from one phonetic sound to the other, like the octopus moving to the P for pulpo. But
yes, absolutely. I've been thinking about that. And obviously, I would want to have some more collaborators from the other languages to help make sure that we're getting it right. But I definitely see that. And the more we can do efficacy studies that show its impact, I think that, it could definitely help in those areas as well.
awesome.
Devar has another question. How would you say this applies to numbers, or does this apply to numbers?
Right now, it does not apply to numbers. Someone has asked me from a math science perspective if I had any ideas about how to teach different math principles, and I'm excited to take on that question. I think it's slightly different from the reading question, but it would be interesting to see what this type of technology could do inside of that math science space.
Looks like Danny has a question. So curious as to whether there is research as to whether students who use this eventually get to a point where they don't need it anymore.
Well, yes, the one anecdotal story that I had from the kid who had stayed a year inside of the Seward's after school club, by the end of the year, he was on track. At the beginning of the year, he was way off a track of where he needed to be, but by the end of the year, he was. And they don't need it after they've learned the sounds. With the web browser extension, I'm hoping that it will be more of a scaffolding tool that people will need for a while and maybe not use it as much in the future, but that all remains to be seen. We're partnering with the Communication Sciences and Disorders program here at the University of Cincinnati to do some tests with the browser extension and C-type font on 3 different populations, one of them being middle schoolers, the other one being prison population, and then English as a second language to kind of know more about that.
Awesome.
That sounds really interesting to learn more about this as English as a second language. Some of the things that you were showing, they felt really more intuitive to understand how to pronounce words. And I've, as the, a first generation myself, I'm like, sometimes it's the hardest thing short of having someone say it to you or looking it up online. I think that type of visualization of sound is really interesting. Such a great idea. Have you done much with English as a second language testing at this point?
Not really. There was one school we tested in where it had quite a bit of English as a second language students. It's called the Academy of All World Language. So there was a blend, a lot of people from Africa, some people from Asian cultures, and even there was a second school that had quite a bit of Latinos inside of the school. And they were all in the club because they were all considered at risk of reading issues. So they seemed to progress. Oh, I should say that we did, I do have measures on this one I want to talk about. We won a grant in Singapore, and we tested it on international schools, 5 international schools in Singapore. And we actually saw it having a difference inside of the decoding aspect from that. That's what came out significant out of that study. We're continuing that study over in Singapore, and I'm excited to see what the web browser extension, what it would do for English as a second language. But primarily, most of the testing has been the iPad app.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Nini. Hey, Paul. He asked a question for you, too. Could you tell us more about the font technology that allows you to do what you're doing?
So it's called variable font technology. It's actually been around for quite a long time. I was actually able to speak with Microsoft last week, and they were very interested because they said that they actually invented that technology, and to see what it could do inside of reading was super exciting for them. But it's using, I'm trying to say, so it's using interpolation, and so you can create one state and another state just like you were in motion, and then there is basically math equations that will allow it to morph between different states. And you're able to now embed that technology into a font file that's relatively small that can be used on screen. So this font could be used inside of Microsoft Word or InDesign, and you can you can rotate through. Why did I use Roboto? Roboto is open source for us to use as a base typeface when I was using, and we have permissions to use it in that way. Also spent, yeah, so that's the reason why we use Roboto.
Allison,
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
One other thing I could say about variable font technology, I was talking to Sam Berlow of the Font Bureau, and he was saying that while variable font technology has been out for some time, it has yet to prove its worth, right? I'm sure you guys have seen things where it's changing from thin to thick or wide to skinny. There's also technologies where now they're putting icons in there and they're making them dance across the screen, which are all fun to look at, but the Y has never been in there. And so I'm hoping that with what we're creating here, we're actually addressing an actual problem with the variable font technology.
Okay, we have another question here from Allison Colvin. What would you say were your biggest challenges in developing the font and how you worked through those challenges?
There's been so many challenges. So I think one of the biggest challenges is sticking with it through challenges and realizing that a bad day is just a bad day and there's got to be a way around all problems. There was one moment where I thought all of this was going to stop in terms of the research, because it was hard to persuade a school to allow me to come in and then give me a set of kids, being a graphic designer, to test something that was visual on helping their kids read. I don't really have the street creds because I'm not an educator, right? So it was like drilling in cement to get that happen. So got a school that was interested and said could do it after school, but they said, you got to get the kids home after the club is done. And I'm like, I don't have money for that. And they're like, well, you're going to need money to buy a bus. I'm like, how am I going to get a bus? Nobody will fund a bus. So there was a time there where I was like, this won't go because I can't get a bus. But somehow it all worked out. We didn't need a bus. The parents were willing to come and pick up the kids after all.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
There's been, I think I've moved through a lot of different phases, because there's the design phase, which I'm aware of. There is a business side of this that I had to learn. There's the marketing, understanding your audience that I was learning. There's the practical of the new technologies that are happening. But having a great team to work with, like Oscar, and the knowledge that people bring has been so valuable.
Got a couple more questions coming in. This one's from Brandon. With the variable font technology, do you see the potential for this to be utilized in other areas of user experience beyond education?
For sure. And I think like Adobe and places like that are already thinking about what role that needs to play inside of their different applications that they have moving forward. I definitely see it as being a plus. Even I know that there's a study going on where they're looking at Acrobat, and just having text files in Acrobat, and when it changes scale, how do you use the variable font technology in terms of legibility, just in order for us to read this quickly and frankly, and any changes that might slightly need to happen to the letters to maintain legibility when things shift. So yeah, I think it has a lot of great potential in a lot of places.
This next one's from Devar. What are the particular signs of a kid who has dyslexia beyond not being able to read properly? And can this help adults?
So there are adults that have dyslexia and some that were never diagnosed with dyslexia early on. I even have had some students of mine in college that have gotten diagnosed inside of college because sometimes it can slip past. I'm not an expert in dyslexia. I do know enough to know that it is an umbrella term like autism. And inside of dyslexia, there are smaller conditions that are each very different from each other. There's a form of dyslexia called dysgraphia, and literally the letters are in motion, right? There's a form there where actually for, I guess, a typical reader, black and white holds the most contrast, but for them, black and white holds the least contrast. And so having the adjustment of colors makes things more legible to them. The type of dyslexia I'm dealing with, there's a phonological disorder, which is the more typical one.
Then Paulini looks like he sent a link that Adobe used to do multiple masters fonts some years ago, which might be a similar tech. Maybe you've heard of that, Adobe multiple masters fonts.
I actually have not heard of that before, but yeah, I have not heard that before. But I wouldn't be surprised. Variable font technology has been around for a long time, but it actually hitting the mainstream, you know, it's just, I feel like it's just now hitting the point of the mainstream. I should also say that the things I'm developing, while Caleb was the inspiration with dyslexia, it pushed past there. Everybody that we were testing were at risk and not dyslexic. So he was the focus of it. And the idea is to design well for a small specific group in hopes it has impact for a lot of others. That's the principle of universal design.
Just one more. Is the system compatible with all browsers? Can you test it that way?
It's in Chrome right now. From talking to Microsoft, it should be workable in something called Edge. I'm not sure it works in Firefox. There's another one that it's working inside of.
That's cool. And does it work on just any web page you go to, or are there some pages that it wouldn't work with based on the way the page is rendered?
So I will say we're in beta mode. So there's probably a lot of like coding glitches that we're trying to go in every day and repair. So understand that you're looking at a beta tool. It should work on any website that has digital contents, like the text actually being there, not images. So it should work on any of them. If you find any that don't work, let us know. Early on, there were a couple and we had to code some things differently, but yeah, it should work on all digital content.
Yeah, that's awesome. I help teach ESL on Monday nights, and I'll be really interested in testing that with some of the students. I think most of the students we have difficulty with are people coming in from China for the first time, so they're not only learning a new alphabet with the pronunciation, and it's quite often they use the Google Translate, but I think that giving them small paragraphs with testing that and see how it affects their reading comprehension over that course of a few years.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how that goes. Yeah, I'd love to hear that. I might have to tell my communication science and disorder PhD students, maybe they'll want to talk to you about using yours as some subjects for us.
Yeah, and our students, they're all adults. They're moving in here, you know, so they're really surrounding themselves with English for the first time. So it brings a different set of a difficulty in the learning, because I think that their children, they pick it up and no problem in a few months. But yeah, I'd love to connect with you about that. And
yeah, absolutely.
After the call here.
Absolutely.
Maybe one last call for questions. I think we're just about ready to wrap up, guys.
Mm-hmm. All
right, looking pretty good. Well, thank you so much, Reneé. This has been a treat, very educational. Oh, wait, maybe there's one more. Okay, you squeaked in, Ali. I remember you showing this to us years ago. Can't believe how far it has evolved. The new font looks great. Congrats on all of the success.
Oh, thank you
Good
so
job.
much. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, we'll send you a big clap from here.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you
Reneé.
so much.
Awesome.
I so
Awesome work.
enjoyed. Happy you guys could come.
All right.
All right, everybody have a great rest of your Thursday and a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
Great.
Bye.
Hope you can join us in the next event, people.
Yes.
See you later.